The longest sentenences in U.S. criminal justice history were handed out often to women who were accused of late onset female sexual predation of children in daycare centers. The FBI invented a whole new category of perpetrator, a category that didn't exist, because there are no late onset female child sexual predators. They don't exist. But there were women who obtained prison sentences of several hundred years for hypothetically being involved in these satanic daycare abuse rituals. And there was it just swept across the whole country like the Salem witch trials, except at a much larger scale. There's a book called Satan's Silence that was written by a lawyer and a social worker that documents it. It's just unbelievable. There were stories about underground tunnels where children were being taken down and being, well, every possible thing you could think of was happening to them, all in the name of like satanic ritual. It was a contagion. And those things happened. It happened with cutting behaviors. It happened with eating disorders. This is almost all among girls, because teenage girls are most prone to this. They called it hysteria back in Freud's time, but there's a book by a man named Henry Ellenberger called Discovery of the Unconscious that traces back psychogenic epidemics to about 300 years. And I knew that, people in adolescence, especially people of a certain personality configuration, have some trouble settling into a stable identity. And for a variety of reasons, it can be high negative emotion, which is associated with low self-esteem. Those are more or less the same thing. And then, in all likelihood, high trait openness, which is the creativity dimension. And the high trait openness people, they're the ones that are more likely to have green hair and red hair and lots of piercings and lots of tattoos and dress in a non-standard manner, let's say. That's all associated with creative behavior. And they have trouble catalyzing a single identity. And then if you throw in categorical confusion, which is exactly what you're doing when you declare that there's, an endless number of gender identities, then people who are prone to identity dissociation and to psychogenic contagion, you're going to demolish them.
There is an obsession.
Abigail Schreier has documented that quite nicely in her book, Irreversible Damage. And it's way more girls than boys. And it's thousands and thousands and thousands of them. So you think, well, perhaps a few people who are transgender benefited from this new reality. But for everyone who's benefited, and, I'd like to see the data just showing how much they actually benefited. And that'll take a long time to accrue. There's 1,000 people who've been just demolished by this. So, and then what else that's basically that on the political front. I could see all that coming. I talked to the Canadian Senate about it when they put in the legislation. They didn't listen. They just thought racism, bigotry, sexism. It's like, yeah, have it your way. But, so what, all these girls that have rapid onset gender dysphoria and are disfiguring themselves and taking hormones and, wreaking havoc with themselves and their families and the broader culture. These people that were so woke and so permissive, you think they're going to have that on their conscience? They're on to something, some other noble venture. So.
Give me your thoughts on the modern dating market.
Well, I'm too old to really have any thoughts on it in some sense.
Not from a personal perspective.
Well, I don't understand it at a level of detail. I do know some things that are happening perhaps at universities where there are far more girls than boys, women than men. What happens in those institutions, this is what it looks like anyways, possibly. So females are hypergamous, which means they'll mate across and up hierarchies, socioeconomic hierarchy, but competence hierarchy is really at the bottom of it. And so when you set up a situation where there's far more women than there are men in a given domain, say where mate selection can take place, most of the men still don't do very well because most of them are still rejected by women. But a small minority of men do extraordinarily well if you think well means unlimited sexual access. And so what's happening in the universities is that a small minority of men have sexual carte blanche in some sense. And most men are in the same position that most young men are always in, which is they're in a state where they're not particularly desirable to women. And then the women, of course, are terribly frustrated because the minority of men that they would really like to have long-term relationships with, it's a seller's market for those men.
They're not settling down. That's the sex ratio hypothesis.
Yeah.
And the reverse happens, right? That you see whoever the more scarce sex is gets to determine the rules of the game. Mm-hmm. So the men, if they are in high demand because there's short supply, you get more short-term mating.
Yeah.
You get an increase in relationship dissatisfaction from women. And when the reverse happens, you get more dates before sex. You get more long-term mating. You also get more sexual violence in that situation as well, when there is a surplus of men and a scarcity of women. I think there's something...
You also get far more unstable societies. You know, I was pilloried a few years back for my comments about enforced monogamy because they were taken out of context and twisted in exactly the way that things like that get twisted now. But
what did you mean by that?
I mean that one human universal is the construction of societies to both mandate and reward monogamy. And there's all sorts of reasons for that. It's because it's the best long-term solution, fundamentally. But one of the reasons for that is that when women are scarce, men get violent. Now, you know, that was read to say, well, I thought that this society should be distributing women to undeserving men, which is, of course, absolutely and utterly preposterous and bears no relationship whatsoever to anything I ever said or thought, or anything anyone sane would ever think or say, or has ever thought or said. Because I don't know anyone politically ever who was insane enough to think that the state should distribute women to men. Like, that's just never happened. So to be accused of that belief, and then for that to, you know, be put forward as a credible representation of what I thought was just one of the preposterous things that has happened to me.
It's an unfortunate name, enforced monogamy, because it's a term from anthropology, right? But what you mean is culturally celebrated monogamy, culturally and norms that are supporting people and raising that up as an institution.
Supporting and punishing, both, but mostly supporting. I mean, the punishing is that there's a moral disapproval applied to, say, cheating, right? To adultery, to especially running around behind your partner's back if you're married, particularly that. But even if you're in a long-term stable relationship, it's like, well, that's all enforcement. It's not police with jackboots, but that's not the only type of enforcement. It's not the only type of sanction or threat or punishment or disappropriation or disgust or contempt or shame or frustration or disappointment, all of those things. And all of that because monogamy is a good long-term solution, but in some sense a troublesome short-term solution if you have other options. Then all of those elements of social support, let's say, need to be put into place. And that is it, as far as I've been able to determine by looking at the anthropological literature. Norms surrounding monogamy are a human universal. There are exceptions, but there are very specific situational reasons for those exceptions. So,
you see the ONS data that came out a couple of weeks ago that said for the first time ever since records began, 50.1% of women are childless by 30. So there are more women without children at 30 than there are women with children. The first time ever.
Well, so this is somebody clipped a part of one of my podcasts, I believe it was, where I was talking about what our society does to 19-year-old women, or 18-year-old women, 19-year-old women. We just lie to them all the time. You know, the first lie is, there's nothing more important than your career, more or less by definition. So that's the first lie. The second lie is, there will be nothing more important to you in your life than your career. So that's the second lie. And then the third lie is, there should be nothing more important in your life than your career. So that's the third lie. And then implicit in that is the idea that children are a burden, and that the idea that women should have children is part of the oppressive patriarchy and should be resisted, and who are men to tell me what I can do with my body. Hey, fair enough, and et cetera, et cetera.